Karoline Leavitt woke up early that Monday morning with a mix of excitement and fear in her stomach. Today was her first big case as a real lawyer. She had passed the bar exam just 3 months ago, and now she was going to stand in front of Judge Harold Baker, who everyone said was the toughest judge in Riverdale County. She put on her best navy blue suit, the one she had saved up for months to buy while still in law school. It was nothing fancy, but it was professional and made her feel confident. As she dressed, her fingers touched the small silver cross that hung from a thin chain around her neck. The cross had been a gift from her grandmother when Karoline graduated from high school. She never took it off, not even when she showered. "You can do this," she told her reflection in the mirror. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her blue eyes looked serious behind her glasses. At 28, she looked younger than most lawyers, which was sometimes a problem. People didn't always take her seriously. Her phone buzzed, with a message from her client, Betty Mills, a 72-year-old widow who was being forced out of her apartment of 30 years by a big real estate company. They claimed she had violated her lease by keeping a small bird as a pet, but Karoline had found a clause that should protect her client. "On my way to court. Praying for us," the message read. Karoline smiled. Betty was a sweet woman who reminded her of her own grandmother. This case meant everything to her. If Betty lost, she would be homeless. Karoline couldn't let that happen. The courthouse was an old stone building in the center of town. As Karoline walked up the steps, she saw other lawyers rushing past her, their expensive briefcases swinging. Most of them were from big firms. Karoline had started her own small practice right out of law school, working from a tiny rented office. Above a coffee shop, her phone rang. It was her roommate, Diane Powell. "Good luck today. You're going to crush it," Diane said. "I hope so. Judge Baker scares me a little," Karoline admitted. "Just remember what Professor Allen always said. Know the law better than anyone else in the room, and you'll never be afraid." Karoline smiled, remembering her favorite law school professor. "Thanks, Diane. I'll call you after." The courtroom was already half full when Karoline entered. She spotted Betty sitting nervously in the front row. Next to her was a young man Karoline didn't recognize. Betty's grandson, maybe? Karoline gave her client a reassuring smile and a thumbs up before setting her worn briefcase on the table marked Plaintiff. On the other side of the room, 3 men in expensive suits sat at the defense table. They represented Sunset Properties, the company trying to evict Betty. The lead attorney was Jack Peterson, a well-known lawyer who had never lost an eviction case. He glanced at Karoline and smirked slightly. At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called out, "All rise," the Honorable Judge Harold Baker presiding. Judge Baker was a tall, thin man with thick gray eyebrows that seemed to have a life of their own. He moved quickly to his seat and began shuffling through papers without looking up. "First case, Mills versus Sunset Properties. An eviction dispute," he announced. "Counsels, please state your names for the record." Jack Peterson stood up first. "Jack Peterson for Sunset Properties, Your Honor. With me are my associates Larry Green and Paul Smith." Karoline rose next, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her. "Karoline Leavitt for Betty Mills, Your Honor." Judge Baker looked up then, his eyes narrowing as he studied Karoline. She stood tall, trying to project confidence. Then his gaze dropped to her neck, and his expression changed. "Ms. Leavitt, what is that you're wearing?" he asked sharply. Karoline's hand went to her throat. "My necklace, Your Honor." "Yes, that religious symbol. In my courtroom, we maintain secular standards. Religious displays of any kind are not permitted." Karoline was confused. She had never heard of such a rule. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I've worn this cross for many years. It's of personal significance to me." Judge Baker's eyebrows came together in a deep frown. "The personal significance is irrelevant, Counselor. In this courtroom, we observe strict neutrality. I will not have attorneys influencing the court with religious symbols." Jack Peterson was watching with interest now, a small smile playing on his lips. The courtroom had gone very quiet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I don't believe there's any court rule that," Karoline began. "There doesn't need to be a written Rule, Ms. Leavitt. This is my courtroom and I set the standards for appropriate conduct. Judge Baker's voice had risen slightly. You are hereby fined $250 for contempt of court. Either remove the necklace now or pay the fine by the end of the day. Karoline stood frozen in shock. Betty was staring at her with wide, worried eyes. The defense attorneys were whispering to each other and smiling. Your Honor, Karoline said, finding her voice, I believe this order may infringe on my First Amendment rights to religious expression. The judge's face flushed red. Are you questioning my authority, counselor? No, Your Honor. I'm simply noting a potential constitutional issue. I would like to request time to research relevant precedents before removing my necklace or paying the fine. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Few attorneys, especially new ones, ever challenged Judge Baker. He was known for holding grudges against lawyers who questioned him. You have 48 hours, Ms. Leavitt, Judge Baker said finally, his voice cold. Now, shall we proceed with the case, or would you like to continue wasting the court's time? Karoline swallowed hard. We're ready to proceed, Your Honor, for... The next hour, Karoline presented her case for why Betty Mills should not be evicted. She explained that the lease actually allowed for small caged birds as pets, pointing to a clause on page 17 that Sunset Properties had overlooked. She also showed that Betty had gotten written permission from the previous property manager 10 years ago. Despite her solid arguments, Karoline could feel Judge Baker's disapproval throughout her presentation. He interrupted her frequently and seemed to favor every objection from the defense team. By the time the hearing ended, Karoline knew she was in trouble. Not only was Betty's case looking shaky, but now Karoline herself was facing a fine she couldn't easily afford. As a new lawyer with student loans and a struggling practice, $250 was a significant amount. What happened in there? Betty asked, anxiously as they left the courtroom. Will I lose my home because of a necklace? No, absolutely not, Karoline assured her, though she wasn't feeling as confident as she sounded. The judge's personal feelings about my cross don't change the facts of your case. The law is on our side. But that fine, you can't afford that on what I'm paying you, Betty fretted. Karoline squeezed the older woman's hand. Don't worry about the fine. I'm going to fight it. Fight Judge Baker? No one does that, Betty warned. Maybe it's time someone did, Karoline replied. As they walked down the courthouse steps, Karoline noticed Jack Peterson watching them from the entrance. He smiled and called out, First lesson of law school, Leavitt. Know your judge. Baker hates religious displays almost as much as he hates losing. Karoline ignored him and helped Betty into a taxi. Once her client was safely on her way home, Karoline sat on a bench outside the courthouse and called Diane. How did it go? Diane asked eagerly. Not great, Karoline admitted and explained about the fine. Diane gasped. He can't do that. That's clearly unconstitutional. That's what I think too, but I need to be sure. I've got 48 hours to research precedents. You know, Diane said thoughtfully, I think my boss mentioned something about Baker doing this before. Let me ask around. That night, Karoline's small apartment turned into a research center. Books and papers covered every surface. She printed out cases from the Supreme Court database and highlighted key sections. The more she read, the more convinced she became that Judge Baker was wrong. Around midnight, Diane came home with a bombshell. Baker has fined at least 3 other attorneys for wearing crosses. Never any other religious symbols, just crosses. Karoline looked up from her laptop. Are you sure? Positive. My boss remembered 2 cases, and a paralegal from Jackson & Smith told me about another one. They all just paid the fines to avoid making waves. Karoline pushed her glasses up on her nose, her tired eyes suddenly alert. That changes everything. If he's only targeting Christian symbols, that's religious discrimination. What are you going to do? Diane asked. Karoline closed her laptop and smiled for the first time that day. I'm going to teach Judge Baker a lesson about the Constitution. Karoline barely slept that night. Her mind kept going over court cases and legal principles. By the time sunlight peeked through her blinds, her eyes were red, but her brain was full of ideas. She had found exactly what she needed to fight Judge. Baker's unfair fine. She took a quick shower, made a strong cup of coffee, and got back to work. Books and papers covered her small kitchen table. Her laptop had 20 browser tabs open, all with important court cases about religious freedom. Diane came into the kitchen, still in her pajamas. She looked at the mess and smiled. "You didn't sleep at all, did you?" "Maybe an hour," Karoline admitted. "But I found some amazing cases. Look at this one." She pointed to a highlighted section of paper. The Supreme Court ruled that wearing religious symbols is protected speech under the First Amendment. Diane read over her shoulder. "This is great, but will it be enough to convince Baker? He's pretty set in his ways." "I'm not done yet," Karoline said, taking a big sip of coffee. "I need to prove that he's targeting Christian symbols specifically. Can you help me find out more about those other lawyers he fined?" "I'll try," Diane promised. "I'll ask around at work today. But be careful, Karoline. Baker has a lot of friends. In high places." After Diane left for work, Karoline called Betty to update her on the eviction case. "Don't worry about yesterday," she told her client. "I'm still confident we can win your case. The lease clearly allows birds." "I'm more worried about you," Betty said. "That judge seemed to have it out for you because of your cross. My late husband was a carpenter who made church furniture. I know how much pressure Christians can face sometimes." "I'll be fine," Karoline assured her. "Actually, this might turn out to be a blessing in disguise. If I can prove Judge Baker is discriminating based on religion, it could help other lawyers too." After hanging up, Karoline headed to the county law library. It was bigger than her apartment and had resources she couldn't access online. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, had been helping law students and lawyers for 30 years. "Good morning, Karoline," Mrs. Foster greeted her. "You look like you've been up all night." "Almost," Karoline admitted. "I need everything you have on religious expression in courtrooms and judicial bias cases." Mrs. Foster raised an eyebrow. "Sounds serious. Follow me." For the next 4 hours, Karoline dug through law books and court records. Mrs. Foster brought her case files that weren't even digitized yet. By lunchtime, Karoline had filled a legal pad with notes and copied dozens of relevant pages. "You might want to check these too," Mrs. Foster said, placing 3 more books on Karoline's table. "These cover judicial ethics and court procedures. Judges have to follow rules too, you know." Karoline smiled gratefully. "You're a lifesaver, Mrs. Foster." "Just doing my job," the librarian replied. "And between us, it's about time someone stood up to Judge Baker. He's been getting away with his little power trips for too long." Around 2 o'clock, Karoline's phone buzzed with a text from Diane. "Got names of all 3 lawyers Baker fined, all A, were wearing crosses. Meeting you at the coffee shop at 4. Big news." Karoline could hardly wait, but she used the remaining time to finish her research. By the time she packed up her materials, she had a solid legal argument against Judge Baker's fine. She just needed to prove the pattern of discrimination. The coffee shop was busy when Karoline arrived. She spotted Diane waving from a corner table and hurried over. "You won't believe what I found out," Diane said excitedly. "I talked to all 3 lawyers who were fined by Baker for wearing crosses. But here's the crazy part. I also confirmed that at least 4 other attorneys have worn different religious symbols in his courtroom with no problems." "Are you serious?" Karoline leaned forward. "Completely. Lisa Garcia wears a small Star of David necklace. Baker never said a word. Aaron Johnson is Sikh and wears a turban. Baker was perfectly fine with it. And get this, Mary Wilson wore a hijab in Baker's courtroom last month during that big insurance case. No fine, no comment, nothing." Karoline's heart raced. This was exactly what she needed. "Do you think they would be willing to sign statements about this?" "Lisa and Aaron already said they would. I haven't reached Mary yet." "This is perfect," Karoline said. "Now I can prove Baker is selectively enforcing his so-called secular standards only against Christian symbols. That's textbook religious discrimination." "So what's your plan?" Diane asked. "I'm going to prepare a formal objection to the fine, with all the legal precedents I found today. Then I'll present evidence of Baker's selective enforcement. If he still insists on the fine, I'll file a complaint with the Judicial Review Board." Diane looked worried. That's pretty bold for a new lawyer. Baker could make life difficult for you. I know. But this isn't just about me anymore. Karoline's blue eyes were determined behind her glasses. If I don't stand up now, he'll keep doing this to other Christian lawyers. That evening, Karoline worked late into the night again, typing up her objection to the fine. She carefully cited Supreme Court cases like Good News Club versus Milford Central School and Capitol Square Review Board versus Pinette, which protected religious expression. She also detailed Baker's pattern of only targeting Christian symbols, while allowing other religious items. The next morning, Karoline dressed carefully in her second-best suit. She couldn't afford to look anything but professional. The silver cross hung from her neck as always. She had no intention of removing it. At the courthouse, she learned that Judge Baker had a full docket that day. She would have to wait until he had a break between cases. While waiting, she noticed Jack Peterson, the lawyer from Sunset Properties, walking down the hall. "Well, if it isn't the Crusader," he said with a smirk. "Still wearing that cross, I see." "I am," Karoline replied, calmly. "Freedom of religion is an important right." Jack shook his head. "You're making a mistake challenging Baker. He doesn't forget when lawyers cross him. Your client might pay the price." Karoline felt a flash of anger. "Are you suggesting that Judge Baker would rule against my client because of a personal issue with me? Because that would be serious judicial misconduct." Jack's smirk faded. "I'm just giving you friendly advice. Take it or leave it." He walked away quickly. Around noon, the bailiff told Karoline that Judge Baker would see her in his chambers. She took a deep breath and followed the bailiff down a long hallway to a heavy wooden door. Judge Baker was sitting behind a large desk, reading glasses perched on his nose. He didn't look up when she entered. "Ms. Leavitt," he said finally, "I assume you're here about the fine." "Yes, Your Honor. I've prepared a formal objection." She placed the document on his desk. Judge Baker glanced at it without picking it up. "Let me save us both some time. The fine stands. Either remove the religious symbol or pay by the end of today." Karoline stood her ground. "With respect, Your Honor, I believe this fine violates my First Amendment rights to religious expression and free speech. The Supreme Court has consistently ruled that wearing religious symbols is protected. This is my courtroom, Ms. Leavitt. I set the standards of decorum. Standards must be applied equally to be valid, Your Honor. I have evidence that you've only enforced this rule against Christian symbols while allowing other religious items." For the first time, Judge Baker looked uncomfortable. "That's not true. I have signed statements from attorneys who have worn other religious symbols in your courtroom without comment or penalty. If you enforce this fine against me, I will file a formal complaint with the Judicial Review Board for religious discrimination." The judge's face turned red. "Are you threatening me, counselor?" "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply exercising my legal rights, just as I'm advising my client to do in her eviction case." They stared at each other for a long moment. Karoline's heart was pounding, but she didn't look away. Finally, Judge Baker sighed. "You're making a big mistake, Ms. Leavitt. I was trying to help you understand how things work in real courtrooms, not law school classrooms, but if you insist on making this a federal case, so be it." "Thank you for your time, Your Honor," Karoline said politely. "I look forward to continuing Mrs. Mills's case tomorrow." She turned to leave. "Ms. Leavitt," Judge Baker called after her. "This won't end well for you." Karoline paused at the door. "I believe in our legal system, Your Honor. Justice will prevail." As she walked back through the courthouse, Karoline felt both terrified and exhilarated. She had stood up to one of the most powerful judges in the county. Now she had to be ready for whatever came next. Word spread quickly about Karoline's stand against Judge Baker. By that evening, her phone was ringing nonstop. 3 local lawyers called to offer their support. The pastor from her church left a message saying the congregation was praying for her. Even her old law professor, Dr. Allen, emailed to say he was proud of her courage. "I never expected this much attention," Karoline told Diane as they ate Chinese takeout in their apartment that night. "You're taking on the most feared judge in the county." "Of course people are talking," Diane replied, picking up a piece of sweet and sour chicken with her chopsticks. "The question is, are you ready for tomorrow? Baker isn't going to make your life easy in court. Karoline nodded. I've prepared all night for Betty's case. The law is on our side. Baker would have to ignore the lease agreement completely to rule against us, which he might do just to spite you, Diane warned. If he does, we'll appeal, and if he shows any bias in court, that will just strengthen my complaint against him. Karoline pushed her food around, too nervous to eat much. I'm more worried about Betty. She can't afford to lose her home while we fight appeals. One step at a time, Diane advised. Win tomorrow's case first. Karoline slept better that night but still woke up early to review her notes one more time. As she got ready for court, she noticed her hands were shaking slightly. She took a moment to pray for strength, touching her silver cross for comfort. The courtroom was packed when Karoline arrived. Word had gotten out about her challenge to Judge Baker, and it seemed like half the local legal community had shown up to watch. Betty sat in the front row, looking nervous in her best dress. Karoline gave her a reassuring smile. Jack Peterson and his team were already at the defense table, heads together in whispered conversation. They looked up when Karoline entered, and Jack gave her a small nod that almost seemed respectful. At exactly 9 a.m., Judge Baker entered. His face was a carefully blank mask as he called the court to order. We're continuing the eviction case of Mills versus Sunset Properties, he announced. I believe both sides were in the middle of presenting their arguments. Ms. Leavitt, you may continue. Karoline stood, her cross visible against her blouse. She noticed Judge Baker's eyes flick to it briefly, but he said nothing. Thank you, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit C, which is the lease agreement signed by Mrs. Mills 5 years ago when Sunset Properties purchased the building. For the next hour, Karoline presented her case with calm precision. She showed him that the lease specifically allowed small caged pets with no exclusion of birds. She presented the written permission Mrs. Mills had received from the previous property manager. She even brought in an expert on tenant rights, who testified that eviction based on a pet bird was extreme and unusual. Throughout her presentation, Karoline waited for Judge Baker to interrupt or show bias, but he remained surprisingly professional. He asked tough questions of both sides and took careful notes. The only sign of his anger was a slight tightness around his mouth when he looked at Karoline. When it was the defense's turn, Jack Peterson argued that the new management had a strict no-pets policy and that Mrs. Mills had been given ample warning to remove the bird. Your Honor, Jack concluded, Sunset Properties has the right to enforce its policies consistently across all properties. Making an exception for Mrs. Mills would create a precedent that could affect hundreds of other units. Judge Baker nodded thoughtfully. I'll take this matter under advisement and issue my ruling tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned. As people began to file out, a court clerk approached Karoline. Judge Baker would like to see you in his chambers. Immediately, she said quietly. Betty grabbed Karoline's arm. What does that mean? Is it about my case? Don't worry, Karoline assured her. It's probably about the fine. I'll call you later, okay? Judge Baker was standing by his window when Karoline entered his chambers. He didn't turn around immediately. Close. The door, Ms. Leavitt, he said. Karoline did as he asked, then waited silently. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her face calm. Finally, Judge Baker turned to face her. You presented a good case today, very thorough. Thank you, Your Honor, Karoline said, surprised by the compliment, which makes what I'm about to say even more difficult. He sat down at his desk and looked at her directly. I've been a judge for 27 years. In that time, I've developed certain standards for my courtroom. One of those is the absence of religious symbols that might influence proceedings. With respect, Your Honor, the Constitution, he held up a hand to stop her. I'm aware of your legal arguments. I've read your objection thoroughly. Your research is impressive for a new attorney. Karoline waited, unsure where this was going. The truth is, Ms. Leavitt, I've reconsidered the fine. Judge Baker sighed heavily. You're right that I've been inconsistent in my enforcement. That was an oversight on my part. Karoline could hardly believe what she was hearing. Does this Mean you're withdrawing the fine? Yes. He didn't look happy about it. But I want to be clear about something. This doesn't mean I approve of religious displays in my courtroom. I still believe strongly in maintaining secular spaces in our judicial system. I understand, Your Honor. Thank you for reconsidering. Judge Baker leaned forward. There's something else we need to discuss. Your threat to file a complaint with the Judicial Review Board. It wasn't a threat, Your Honor. Just a statement of my intent if the fine remained in place. Regardless, such a complaint could be damaging to both of us. His eyes narrowed slightly. Your career is just beginning, Ms. Leavitt. A reputation as someone who files complaints against judges could make things difficult for you in this county. Karoline felt a chill. Was he threatening her career? Are you suggesting I should withdraw my complaint even if you've withdrawn the fine? I'm suggesting we could resolve this matter privately without involving the board. I've admitted my error. The fine is canceled. Isn't that enough? Karoline thought carefully before answering. This was a test. If she agreed too quickly, other Christian lawyers would continue to face discrimination. If she refused, she might make an enemy who could hurt her career and her clients. Your Honor, I appreciate your willingness to withdraw the fine. That shows integrity. But this issue is bigger than just me. At least 3 other attorneys have been fined for wearing crosses in your courtroom. Judge Baker frowned. Who told you that? It doesn't matter. What matters is that it happened, and it was wrong. If I drop this now, what happens to the next Christian lawyer who appears before you? You're not making this easy, counselor. I'm not trying to make trouble, Your Honor. I just want to ensure equal treatment for everyone. Karoline took a deep breath. What if we reached a compromise? I won't file the complaint if you agree to refund the fines to the other attorneys and commit to treating all religious symbols equally in the future. Judge Baker stared at her for a long moment. You don't back down easily, do you? Not when I believe I'm right, Karoline said quietly. To her surprise, a small smile appeared on the judge's face. You remind me of myself when I was younger. Stubborn, principled. He sighed. Very well. I'll contact the other attorneys about their fines, and I give you my word that I will enforce any rules about religious symbols equally from now on. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate your fairness. As Karoline turned to leave, Judge Baker called after her. Ms. Leavitt, about Mrs. Mills's case. Karoline froze. Was he going to threaten to rule against Betty because of their dispute? Yes, Your Honor. I want you to know that my ruling will be based solely on the law and the facts presented. Our disagreement will have no bearing on the outcome. Relief flooded through Karoline. I never doubted that, Your Honor. As she left the courthouse, Karoline felt lighter than she had in days. She had stood up for her principles and won. She had protected her right to wear her cross and helped other Christian lawyers too. But most importantly, she had ensured that Betty's case would be judged fairly. She pulled out her phone to call Betty with the good news when she saw a text message from an unknown number. This isn't over. Baker doesn't forget. Watch your back. Karoline stared at the message, her victory suddenly feeling less certain. Karoline stared at the threatening text message for a long time. Who could have sent it? She saved the number but decided not to respond. Instead, she called Betty with the good news about their case. The judge seemed fair today, she told her client, and he promised me that he'll judge our case based only on the facts and the law. That's wonderful, Betty said. And what about your fine for wearing the cross? He withdrew it, Karoline said, smiling to herself. And he agreed to refund the other lawyers he's fined in the past. You're a miracle worker, Betty exclaimed. I knew you were the right lawyer for me the moment we met. Karoline felt a warm glow at the praise, but the mysterious text message still worried her. She decided to show it to Diane when she got home. Diane read the message with a frown. This is creepy. Do you think Baker sent it? I don't think so, Karoline said, shaking her head. He seemed sincere about our agreement. It's more likely someone who's loyal to him. Like one of the other judges? Or maybe Jack Peterson? Maybe. But I can't worry about that now. The ruling on Betty's case is tomorrow, and I need to be ready. That night, Karoline prepared for every possible outcome. If they won, she'd need to help Betty file paperwork to protect her from future eviction attempts. If they lost, she'd need to file an appeal immediately. She worked late into the night, ignoring another text from the same number that simply said, "Prepare to lose everything." The next morning, Karoline dressed carefully in her best suit. She wore her silver cross proudly. No one would intimidate her into hiding her faith. The courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. Karoline spotted several attorneys she recognized, a reporter from the local newspaper, and even Dr. Allen, her law professor. Betty sat in the front row, clutching her purse nervously. Judge Baker entered precisely at 9 a.m. His face gave away nothing as he called the court to order. "In the matter of Mills versus Sunset Properties, I am ready to announce my decision," he said, his voice formal and distant. After careful review of the lease agreement, the testimony presented, and the relevant housing laws, I find in favor of the plaintiff, Mrs. Betty Mills. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Karoline squeezed Betty's hand as the older woman let out a small gasp of joy. The lease clearly permits small caged pets, with no specific exclusion of birds, Judge Baker continued. Furthermore, the written permission from the previous property manager creates a binding agreement that the new owners must honor. The eviction notice is hereby rescinded, and Sunset Properties is ordered to pay Mrs. Mills's legal fees, Jackie. Peterson's face darkened with anger. He leaned over to whisper to his clients, who looked equally upset. "Thank you, Your Honor," Karoline said, trying to keep the surprise out of her voice. She had hoped for a fair ruling, but this was better than she had expected. Judge Baker nodded slightly. Court is adjourned. As people began to leave, Betty threw her arms around Karoline. "You did it. I can keep my home and my little bird." "The law was on our side," Karoline said, hugging her back. And Judge Baker followed the law. They were interrupted by Jack Peterson, who approached with a tight smile. "Congratulations, Ms. Leavitt. You won this round." "It wasn't a game, Mr. Peterson. It was about justice for my client." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just remember, we lawyers have long memories, and Sunset Properties owns a lot of buildings in this town." He walked away before Karoline could respond. Outside the courthouse, several reporters were waiting. A young woman with a press badge approached Karoline. "Ms. Leavitt, is it true that you stood up to Judge Baker over your right to wear a religious symbol in court?" Karoline hesitated. She didn't want to seem like she was bragging about her victory or criticizing the judge after he had ruled fairly. "Judge Dwyer, Baker and I had a professional disagreement that we resolved privately," she said carefully. "I respect his authority as a judge, and I appreciate his fair ruling in today's case. But he fined you for wearing a cross, didn't he?" Another reporter called out. "I'd rather not discuss that. The important news today is that my client, Mrs. Mills, will keep her home. That's what matters." The reporters seemed disappointed by her diplomatic answer, but Karoline didn't care. She had won Betty's case. She had stood up for her principles, and she had earned Judge Baker's respect. That was enough. Back at her small office above the coffee shop, Karoline helped Betty fill out paperwork to ensure she would be protected from future eviction attempts. They celebrated with coffee and muffins from downstairs. "I can't thank you enough," Betty said, her eyes shining with happy tears. "Not just for saving my home, but for standing up for what you believe in. You're an inspiration." Karoline blushed. "I was just doing my job." "No, you did much more than that. You showed courage when most people would have given in." After Betty left, Karoline checked her phone and found 3 new messages from potential clients who had heard about her victory. Her practice was growing already. She smiled to herself, feeling proud of what she had accomplished. Then her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. "Karoline Leavitt speaking." She answered professionally. "Ms. Leavitt, this is Carol White from the State Bar Association. We've received a complaint about you that I need to discuss urgently." Karoline's heart sank. A complaint from whom? The complaint was filed anonymously. but it alleges serious ethical violations. Specifically that you pressured a judge to change a ruling by threatening to file a complaint against him. That's not true, Karoline protested. We take these allegations very seriously, Carol interrupted. There will be a formal investigation, and you'll need to appear before the Ethics Committee next week. Until then, you should consider consulting with an attorney who specializes in professional conduct cases. Karoline felt sick. Someone was trying to destroy her career just as it was beginning. Ms. White, this complaint is completely false. Judge Baker ruled fairly in my case because the law was on our side, not because of any pressure from me. That will be for the committee to decide. You'll receive official notice by mail, but I wanted to give you a courtesy call first. After hanging up, Karoline sat at her desk in shock. Who would do this to her? And why? She had been careful to handle everything professionally with Judge Baker. Their agreement had been reasonable and ethical. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. I warned you. This is just the beginning. Now she understood. Someone was determined to punish her for standing up to Judge Baker, even if the judge himself had accepted her challenge with grace. Someone thought she needed to be taught a lesson. Karoline felt a moment of panic. She was a new lawyer with student loans and a tiny practice. She couldn't afford a scandal or a lengthy ethics investigation. Maybe she should have just paid the fine and kept quiet. Then her eyes fell on her law school diploma hanging on the wall, and beneath it, a small framed quote that her grandmother had given her. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. Karoline touched the silver cross at her neck. She had done nothing wrong. She had stood up for what was right, and she would continue to do so, no matter what. She picked up her phone and called Diane. I need your help again, she said. Someone's filed a false complaint against me with the Bar Association. I'm on my way, Diane replied without hesitation. And I'm bringing pizza and my legal research skills. We'll fight this together. Karoline smiled despite her worry. She wasn't alone in this battle. And if someone wanted a war, they had picked the wrong opponent. She might be a new lawyer, but she was also a legal genius who never backed down from a fight. The next week was the hardest of Karoline's life. The official letter from the State Bar Association arrived, stating that she had to appear before the Ethics Committee on Friday morning. The charges were serious, trying to influence a judge's ruling through threats and misusing the complaint process. If they fined against me, I could lose my license, Karoline told Diane as they prepared her defense in their apartment. Papers and law books covered every surface, much like when she had researched her defense against Judge Baker's fine. They won't, Diane said firmly. We have the truth on our side. Karoline wasn't so sure. But we don't know who filed the complaint, or what evidence they claim to have. Then we need to find out, Diane said. And I think I know where to start. That afternoon, Diane called a friend who worked as a clerk at the State Bar Association. She couldn't get details about the complaint, but she learned one important fact. The complaint had been filed by someone from Sunset Properties. It has to be Jack Peterson, Karoline said when Diane told her. He was angry about losing the case, and he warned me that Sunset Properties has a long reach. But why would he care about your dispute with Judge Baker? Karoline thought about it. Maybe he's just using it as an excuse to hurt my reputation, or maybe there's more to it. She decided to visit Judge Baker directly. If anyone could help clear this up, it would be him. The judge seemed surprised to see her in his office the next day. Ms. Leavitt, what can I do for you? Karoline explained, about the ethics complaint. Someone is claiming I threatened you to change your ruling in the Mills case. You know that's not true. Judge Baker frowned. Of course it's not true. Our discussion about the fine had nothing to do with Mrs. Mills' case, and you never threatened me. You simply stated your intention to file a complaint if I enforced an unfair rule. Will you tell that to the Ethics Committee? Karoline asked. Your testimony could save my career. The judge was quiet for a moment, tapping his fingers on his desk. I'll need to think about it. Getting involved in an ethics dispute is complicated for a sitting judge. I understand, Karoline said, trying to hide her disappointment. "But please consider it. I did nothing wrong." As she turned to leave, Judge Baker spoke again. "Ms. Leavitt, does the name Edward Harrison mean anything to you?" Karoline thought for a moment. "No, should it? He's the owner of Sunset Properties, and he's also my brother-in-law." Karoline stared at the judge in shock. "Your brother-in-law? But you didn't recuse yourself from Betty's case. That's a clear conflict of interest." "Yes," Judge Baker said quietly. "That's why I couldn't rule against you, even though Edward wanted me to. It would have looked too suspicious if anyone discovered our connection. But Edward was furious when I told him I had to follow the law. Suddenly everything made sense. The threatening texts, the ethics complaint. It wasn't about the Cross or Karoline standing up to the judge. It was about a powerful man who wasn't used to losing and would do anything to punish those who defied him." "Why are you telling me this?" Karoline asked. "Because I believe in justice, Ms. Leavitt. Despite our disagreement about religious symbols, I respect your integrity. And what Edward is doing is wrong." Karoline left the courthouse with a new understanding of the situation and a plan. If Edward Harrison wanted to play dirty, she would simply have to outsmart him. That night, she and Diane worked on a new strategy. Instead of just defending herself at the ethics committee, Karoline would go on the offensive. The day of the hearing arrived. Karoline wore her best suit and her silver cross. She walked into the hearing room with confidence even though her heart was pounding. The ethics committee consisted of 5 senior attorneys seated at a long table. In the audience, Karoline spotted Diane, Betty, and several other supporters. She also saw Jack Peterson sitting with an older man she didn't recognize, probably Edward Harrison. The committee chairwoman, Mrs. Lopez, called the hearing to order. "We're here to investigate a complaint against attorney Karoline Leavitt for allegedly threatening a judge to influence a case outcome. Ms. Leavitt, how do you respond to these charges?" Karoline stood. "The charges are completely false, Mrs. Lopez. I never threatened Judge Baker, and our discussion about his fine for my religious symbol had nothing to do with my client's case." "Do you have evidence to support this?" Mrs. Lopez asked. "Yes, I do." Karoline handed the committee members copies of her documentation. "First, I have the objection I filed against Judge Baker's fine, which shows our dispute was solely about religious freedom. Second, I have signed statements from 3 other attorneys who were similarly fined for wearing crosses in Judge Baker's courtroom." The committee members looked through the documents with interest. "Most importantly," Karoline continued, "I have a letter from Judge Baker himself." She held up an envelope that had arrived at her office that morning. "He states clearly that I never threatened him, and that our discussion about the fine had no bearing on his ruling in the Mills case." Jack Peterson stood up. "This is irrelevant. The fact remains that she used the threat of a complaint to pressure a judge." "Mr. Peterson, you're not recognized to speak," Mrs. Lopez said firmly. "Please sit down." Karoline wasn't finished. "There's one more matter the committee should know about. The person who filed this complaint, Mr. Edward Harrison of Sunset Properties, is Judge Baker's brother-in-law, a fact he failed to disclose when filing this complaint. I believe this ethics charge is simply retaliation because Judge Baker ruled against his company in the Mills case." Gasps filled the room. The older man next to Jack Peterson turned red with anger. "That's a serious accusation," Mrs. Lopez said. "It's also true," said a deep voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Judge Baker walking down the aisle. "Edward Harrison is indeed my brother-in-law, and I should have recused myself from the Mills case. That was my error. But Ms. Leavitt knew nothing about this connection, and she never attempted to influence my ruling in any way." The room erupted in whispers. Edward Harrison stormed out, followed by Jack Peterson. After a brief recess, the Ethics Committee returned with their decision. "The committee finds no evidence of ethical violations by Attorney Leavitt," Mrs. Lopez announced. "The complaint is dismissed. Furthermore, we will be opening an investigation into the possible filing of a false complaint by Mr. Harrison and potential conflict of interest violations by Judge Baker." Karoline could hardly believe it was over. Her supporters surrounded her with congratulations. Betty hugged her tightly. "I knew you would win," the older woman said. "You always do." Judge Baker approached Karoline last. "I've submitted my recusal from all Sunset Properties cases," he said, "and I wanted to thank you, Ms. Leavitt." "Thank me? For what?" "For reminding me what justice truly means. It's not about personal preferences or family connections. It's about following the law fairly for everyone." He glanced at her silver cross, including protecting the rights of those whose beliefs may differ from our own. 3 months later, Karoline's law practice was thriving. The story of her stand against religious discrimination and her victory over the false ethics complaint had brought her many new clients. She had even hired Diane, who had decided to finish her law degree. As Karoline worked in her new, larger office downtown, she touched the silver cross at her neck and smiled. What had started as a simple fine had turned into a test of everything she believed in: justice, faith, and courage. She had faced powerful enemies and won, not just for herself, but for others who might have been afraid to stand up. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was a reporter from a national legal magazine. "Ms. Leavitt, we're doing a feature on young lawyers who are making a difference. Your cases have set some important precedents for religious freedom in courtrooms across the state. Would you be willing to share your story?" Karoline smiled. "Yes, I would. It's a story about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. And it's a story that's just beginning." As she hung up the phone, Karoline looked at the framed quote on her wall, the one her grandmother had given her. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it." Those words had guided her through the hardest challenge of her career, and they would continue to guide her in the challenges to come. For Karoline Leavitt, legal genius and woman of faith, this was just the first chapter in a lifelong commitment to justice.